everybody, and welcome. You are tuned into today's PIR live event. I'm your host for today. My name is Mel Kern. Today our guest is Maria Derosa, and she is an assistant professor at Carleton University. We'll learn today how Dr. Derosa's research in nanotechnology helps create smart materials that can recognize and release nutrients based on signals from their environment to improve crops, food security, and food production. So before we get started, I'd like to welcome today's viewer watching the live stream. It's great to have everybody with us today. And for those of you who are watching the live stream, remember you can tweet your questions into us using the hashtag AskPIR throughout this event. And if there's room in your tweet, I know that it's limited characters, but if you can include your name, your city, or your school, then we'll be happy to give you a shout out. So I look forward to getting to some of those questions in just a little while, but first I'm going to turn it over to Maria Derosa. Thank you so much for joining us today. Perhaps you can begin by telling us a little bit more about yourself and your research, Dr. Derosa.
Wonderful. I would love to. Welcome, everyone. As you heard, my name is Maria Derosa, and I am an associate professor in the chemistry department at Carleton. I'm also cross-appointed to biochemistry. And the work that I do for my research is basically, like you heard, nanotechnology. So this is the science and technology of the very small. I'm going to explain a little bit about that in a minute when I start my presentation. So what we're interested in doing with nanotechnology is, first of all, working with biological things to make our nanotechnology, and I'll explain that. We use DNA. And then we're interested in applying this nanotechnology to help for very large problems, things like food security. So I'm going to explain that with a presentation that I've put together, and I think Mel's going to pull it up for us to be able to look at it at the same time as I'm speaking. And I'm really excited to take your questions and to hear what you think about the work we're doing. So maybe we can start our presentation.
Sure can.
Great.
Okay,
Perfect.
so there we go.
Great. So let me get started. So I'm asking a question today. I'm asking the question, can nanotechnology help us feed the world? And what I'm hoping to do today, if we go to the next slide, is to kind of address three questions. The first question that I want to address with you today is, what are some challenges that exist in agriculture? So I'm talking about feeding people, so we need to think about agriculture. And how can these problems be addressed by nanotechnology? The next question I want to answer today is, how is nanotechnology presently being used in agriculture? Is it being used? And if so, how? And the last question I want to ask, I want to look into my crystal ball. You see that little picture there. And I want us to think about, what kind of new technology can we use to improve a very specific aspect of our agriculture, which is fertilizers? And I'm going to explain a term that's in that question, aptamers. That's the work that we do. That's the research that we do is on aptamers. I'm going to explain what that is and how maybe we can use it for future fertilizers. So now we can go to the next slide. And what I want you to look at here is basically, it's going to come up in a second, food security as a concept. This is the idea that everyone has access to enough healthy food. This is the big picture idea of food security, that no matter where you are, you would have access to enough food, and that food is healthy, okay? Enough to support your healthy living. So that's kind of that center circle. There are lots of things that go into that concept of safe, healthy food. We have to think about food quality, right? The food that we're growing has to be healthy. We have to think about food safety, that there isn't something in the food that doesn't belong. And at the top, you see a circle that says crop yields. We need to get enough food for everybody. And then we have to be able to distribute it. It's a complex thing, food security. In the background, you see two other bubbles. So thinking about food security, we have to think about two other ideas. We want our agricultural system to be sustainable, both economically and environmentally. So if we are providing food for everybody, but we're doing it and it's hurting the environment, then that's not really food security. We're not in a state of food security. If we're doing it and people can't afford what we're doing, then that's not food security either. So if we go to the next slide, basically what's going to happen is that you see that I'm highlighting the top part of that graph. I'm saying crop yields is what I'm going to focus on today. So how can we grow more food, respecting that there are a lot of other issues that go into food security, but if I'm just focusing on how can we grow enough food for the people who are on the earth, basically. And a quote pops up for you to take a look at. This is a little bit old. This quote was given in 2007 by the Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. And this is what he said. He said, you cannot feed 6 billion people today and 9 billion coming in 2050. We know our population is growing without judicious use of chemical fertilizers. So what he said that day was that we need chemical fertilizers to feed people because fertilizers put nutrients into the ground, the nutrients end up in the food, and then we eat those nutrients. So we need those nutrients. But notice he says the word judicious. We have to be careful about using fertilizers. So fertilizers are important to feed people, but there's something about fertilizers that makes us worry. You know, we have a concern about them. We have to use them judiciously. So on the next slide, I want to talk about why we have to be concerned about fertilizers. What is it about fertilizers that, you know, is quote unquote maybe dangerous? So if we can go to the next slide, you'll see that the problem with fertilizers is not that they are inherently bad. So the nutrients that are inside fertilizers are nutrients that plants need. They make things like proteins and DNA. They're nutrients we need. But the problem with current fertilizers is that when a farmer goes to apply fertilizer on his or her field, his crop, almost all of that fertilizer is lost. So 50 to 70% of the nutrients that end up on the ground get washed away or end up in the air or end up locked in the soil. So those nutrients that the plants need, they're not getting to the plant. Instead, they're getting washed away. If they get washed away, then that causes environmental problems. So that runoff, for example, damages the aqueous ecosystem. And then if we think about it from a dollars and cents point of view, the farmer has spent money on this fertilizer, on these nutrients. They're important. Otherwise, we wouldn't be spending money on them. But that money is getting washed away too. And it ends up being about $1 billion a year for Canadian farmers. So this is a big problem. There's a high environmental cost to having fertilizers that are inefficient, and there's a high economic cost, right? Really dollars and cents. So what I'm interested in is trying to understand, if we go to the next slide, how we could use nanotechnology to improve nutrient use. The other aspect is things like pesticides. We know that pesticides can be a problem when they end up in the wrong place. We've heard about, for example, bees that are being affected by pesticides that are being used, right? Here again is an efficiency issue. If we can take pesticides and make them so efficient that they never get washed away, they only get used directly where they're needed, then maybe we can avoid some of these environmental problems associated with pesticides. We could use a lot less. So this is another issue, if we again go to the next slide, that we hope we can address with nanotechnology. Okay, so at this point, I want to take a minute to explain what is nanotechnology. I'm talking about this new idea, this new field that could help us solve agricultural problems. What is it? So nano, that prefix, it actually means a billionth. So 10 to the minus 9. So 0.00000, you get 901 at the end. So a very, 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 very tiny thing is nano. If I take a meter stick and cut it into 1 billion pieces, one of those pieces is a nanometer. So that's very tiny, right? What nanotechnology is the science and the study of machines, sensors, devices that are that small on the length scale of 1 to 100 nanometers. So these are, really, really tiny things. Can they help us make fertilizers more efficient? So if we go to the next slide, the first question that I asked when I started my research is nanotechnology being used in agriculture at all? So I started looking through the science literature and also things like patents, which is usually where innovations are basically documented, right? And what I found is that over time, since the 90s, slowly but surely, researchers, companies, people are thinking about using the science of the very, very, very small as a way to improve agriculture. But it's not going very quickly. So if you look at this chart, the bars represent how many papers I found or how much research is being done on fertilizers. And they're on the scale that's on the right-hand side. So we have maybe tens of papers, tens of research projects that are happening. On the left-hand side, that represents the sorts of research that I found where nanotechnology was being used for something like pharmaceuticals, like drug delivery. And there you see the numbers are on the scale of 1 to 1,000, right? So research is happening in both these fields, but it's a fraction in agriculture. It's a fraction of what's happening compared to what's happening in medicine. So we're missing something in agriculture. There's a lot of innovation that can come from nanotechnology. Let's apply it to agriculture like we've been applying it to things like medicine. That was what I was surmising from all this information. So then if we go to the next slide, I started to dig a little bit deeper into what kinds of nanotechnology could we use to improve fertilizer efficiency? What is it about nanotechnology that could make it effective? And what I found was that if we think about plants, because we're trying to feed plants, right, with fertilizers, their roots and leaves are covered with pores and other types of receptors that are on that nano scale. They're very, very, very small. So maybe nanotechnology, given that it would be technology, nutrients that are very, very small, maybe they have a better chance of interacting with these small pores. So it could be more effective. We could use less and get more out of it. And what I'm showing you here are a couple of pictures. On the left-hand side is a series of experiments where a plant was grown in basically a hydroponic way, either in the absence or presence of something called a carbon nanotube. It's basically a rolled up tiny tube made of carbon on the nanoscale. And you can see it in the color of the liquid. The liquid with the nanotubes is a little bit gray, right? And you can look at the plants and you can see just by eye that the plants that are grown in the presence of the nanotubes there's a higher yield, right? They're growing at a faster rate, it seems. And the researchers in this study, they hypothesized that it had to do with bringing water through those tubes and nutrients through those tubes into those small pores in the root surface. The picture that I have on the right-hand side is basically a very, very thin slice of tissue, root tissue from a plant. And you see these little dots, these little dark dots that have an arrow that says NP on them next to that arrow. Those are nanoparticles that were taken up into root tissue in a different experiment. So what these things told me is that if we want to improve uptake, for example, of a nutrient to make sure it's not wasted, if we put in something nano-sized, so a nano-sized delivery vehicle, we could potentially improve the efficiency of that nutrient, improve the uptake of that nutrient, have less wasted. Okay. So the next slide is just basically what the sort of thing was, what I found in the literature. And, maybe this is interesting to you. You would want to look more into this. We've published some reviews on this topic. What sorts of nanotechnology are being used in general, and a lot of times they are the nutrient itself, that top circle, the nutrient itself is made into a nano-sized particle and it's taken up more effectively. But we also might have additives that are nanoscale, and that's on the left-hand side, and we also may have coatings that are nanoscale that help protect the nutrient. And this is where my research is actually interested in going, is looking at coatings. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But if you're interested, on the next slide, I'm just showing you some different companies and websites of existing or potentially future products that want to think about using nanotechnology to improve their efficiency. So it's already out there. It's happening. And now, the question is, how can we continue to apply nanotechnology in this innovative way? So if we go to the next slide, this is bringing me to what my research is about. I'm interested in understanding, can nanotechnology be more than just small? So in those other examples that I was telling you about, we're taking, say, the nutrient that has to go to the crop, and we're making it small so that it's taken up more effectively and less is wasted. And that's a good thing. But what I'm interested in understanding is, can we also have nanotechnology in a way that's smart? So this is where I'm saying, could the delivery of the fertilizer be targeted? Could it be directed rather than just small, also controlled? So it's small, it interacts really well, but it's also smart about releasing the nutrient when it's necessary. So on the next slide, I talk about what my research is about. So let me just take a quick second. I know time is of the essence, but I want to take a quick minute to explain what we do in our lab. We make nanotechnology out of DNA. So DNA is the building block of life. Basically, it's a molecule that holds our genetic code. But we use a synthetic DNA that's called an aptamer. And you see a little picture here on the right of what that red squiggle is. That's a piece of DNA, and it's folded up into a nanoscale kind of shape. And that nanoscale shape allows it to bind to and recognize another molecule. In this picture, it's that blue structure there. That's an amino acid. It's another biological building block. So we work to develop these pieces of DNA that can bind to molecular targets. So our question is then, can we use these special pieces of DNA and the fact that they recognize targets to make a smart fertilizer? So the next thing I want to show you is a little animation that kind of, in a nutshell, will describe this idea for you really quickly in just in a minute. So I think that Mel's going to take a second to go to the next slide and pull up this animation, which might take a little while to get going. But basically, the idea, and you'll see this in a second, is that we're working with collaborators at Agriculture Canada, and they have discovered that crops release chemical signals from their roots. And that's what these blue dots are supposed to represent. And those chemical signals, certain of those chemical signals are actually a call to the environment. Hey, I need nutrients. So if we could answer that call by releasing nutrients only when those blue dots were released, then maybe our fertilizer would not just be small, it would be smart, right? It would give the nutrients only when the crop actually used. So here in the animation, you see these green capsules. And inside the wall of these green capsules are these yellow squiggles. Those are the aptamers, okay? And they're coating the fertilizer, which are these orange balls. It's going to repeat so you have a chance to look at it again. So the idea is that these capsules will protect the fertilizer from leaking out and getting washed away until the blue circles, those signals, hit the aptamer. And then the capsule will release the fertilizer. So can we use the aptamer, recognizing those chemical signals coming from the plant, as like a trigger? So the aptamer recognizes the target, and then the coating breaks down and the fertilizer is released. Or the coating gets pores and more fertilizer can move out of it. That's our research. So if we go now to the next slide, after the animation slide, Mel, so you'll go 2 slides ahead. I'm going to show you some numbers. It's not important that you memorize the numbers, but I want to show you that this actually works. So this is not just science fiction. So we've developed coatings and capsules where we've put aptamers that recognize a certain signal in the coating, and then we've exposed those capsules to solutions that either have that signal or don't have that signal. And if we go to the next, basically hit the forward button one more time, you'll see these numbers. If we have a capsule that is smart and it's in the presence of the signal, We get 5 times more diffusion or release. So that number, diffusion coefficient, is just a number that quantifies how much is being released. We get 5 times more release than if that capsule is not in the presence of that signal. It's in the presence of other signals, but not that specific one that is, I need nutrients. Okay. And so depending on our system, we've had 10 times bump in diffusion, 5 times bump on diffusion. So we're working now, we've moved out of the lab and we're working now in the greenhouse to see if we can make this a reality, take these coatings and put them in the ground and show the same results. The last slide that's actually about this topic is a different type, or I guess we have 2 more slides, is a different idea that we've done, which is capsules that burst when they see the signal from the plant. So this little picture is a cartoon showing how we build these capsules step by step, but the bottom 2 parts of that picture are probably the most important. The aptamer, that nanotechnology, is inside the capsule, and it's basically holding up the walls of the capsule. It's like a scaffold. And when the aptamer gets the plant signal, it lets go of the capsule and folds up onto itself and around the target. So there's nothing holding up the walls of the capsule anymore. So the capsule basically collapses and releases its contents. And so on the next slide, you can see some microscope images of intact and broken capsules. So basically on the left-hand side, we have a capsule that's happy. It's a little bit hard to see in this picture. A capsule that's happy. It's in low concentrations of the target, so not enough to get it to trigger. And on the right-hand side, you see capsule broken and all polymer debris on the top part. And it's basically that the capsule has recognized the signal that's supposed to come from the plant and burst, releasing whatever was inside. So on the last slide is just basically my conclusions. Hopefully in this very short presentation, you've had a chance to hear why fertilizer efficiency is a problem and why we need to think about solving it. Secondly, that nanotechnology could be a part of the solution and we should really be investigating it. And then the last point that I was hoping to make is that we can use these aptamers to make smart films, and that could bring nanotechnology beyond just being small, but also intelligent and effective. So that's my presentation. On the last slide just is a picture of my research group. The work that I do is, maybe it's not there, but anyway, I want to acknowledge my research group because I'm obviously here talking to you about this work while my research students and my graduate students are in the lab actually working on this. So I want to acknowledge them, and I want to acknowledge Carlos Monreal from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and our funding from Alberta Innovates Biosolutions. And I'm happy to take any questions.
That's wonderful. Incredibly interesting how much you are able to do. And it looks, in comparison to, the medical field or the bio field, there's a long way to go for this kind of technology.
Exactly. That's something that really struck us, was that the problems in agriculture and medicine are similar, right? In medicine, we say we want to deliver a drug to the cancer cell, for example, and not the healthy cell. So that's a smart delivery question. And we need the capsule to be biocompatible because it's in our body. Agriculture, it's the same question. I want to deliver the nutrient when the plant needs it and not when it doesn't, and it's going to get wasted. And everything I build this capsule out of has to be biocompatible because it's going to be in the ground, right? And it has to be, it has to have no impact on the environment. So the question is similar, and I think the technology can be applied both ways.
Interesting. Now, first question I have for you, and this is actually my personal question for you, Maria, is how actually do they recognize each other? You're saying that aptamers, they recognize, is it a chemical recognition, or how does that actually work?
Very good question. So the way that we think aptamers work, and this is still a field of research and people are working on it, is that it's something about the way that the aptamer will fold up around the target, if it's a small target, or inside the target. It could be that the target's really big. It could be like a big protein or even a cell, like I said, a cancer cell, for example, and the aptamer just recognizes one little part of the cell. And the way that they interact with each other, it's not it's actually a weak interaction. In chemistry, we call it non-covalent. So if there are chemists listening, they know what I'm talking about. But otherwise, it's a weak reversible reaction. So we could have an aptamer recognizing the target when there's lots of target present. So that could be a case where the plant is, spitting out a lot of this signal and really needs the nutrients. So we're releasing a lot of nutrients because the aptamer is binding the target. But because that interaction is reversible, if there's all of a sudden a low concentration, the plant's full, it doesn't need any more, and the concentration of that target in the ground goes down, 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 then that they can release the target and maybe patch up the hole that's in the capsule in future technology, right? So it could be something that we can turn on and off. So that's something that makes these aptamers really appealing, is that they interact with the target, they can recognize a target, but they can also be reused because they will let go of the target under the right conditions.
That's amazing. It's amazing the type of research and stuff that's being done now. It's incredibly interesting. So I'm going to ask you a little bit more general questions for some of the students who are watching today.
Perfect.
In terms of your research, what was your most memorable discovery?
Oh, well, in this field, so we use aptamers for all sorts of different things. So we use it for agriculture, and we also use it in other fields. Like we're interested in medicines that could be made from aptamers. So that's something that we do as well. But in this area, when I first met my collaborator, Carlos Monreal, and we started talking about this idea, it really was like science fiction to us, right? That plants are going to communicate with nano capsules in the soil, and the soil capsules are going to answer back. And, nobody really even believed us, right? When we would go out to try to get funding and that kind of thing to start the research. So that first experiment, when we were actually testing, could these capsules work, right? So we put the aptamer in, would they actually show any difference in release because they recognize the target? That was back in about 2009 when we did that experiment, and it was with a graduate student named Yasser Sultan, who now works for Environment Canada. And we were basically like all huddled, around this machine, this microscope, watching and, jotting numbers down. So definitely when that idea went from, like I said, science fiction to, actually this could work, that was just an amazing moment.
I can imagine, especially looking for funding and so forth. I'm sure that science fiction aspect, people were thinking, like Little Shop of Horrors, crazy plants,
Yeah.
but it's amazing how different it really is and how far it's come.
Yeah, thank you.
So one last question for you before we sign off for today. I'm going to ask you, what advice would you have for maybe high school students or even public school students at the elementary level who are interested in this kind of technology or future for their education? What suggestions do you have for them?
Excellent. So if we went back in time to when I was in grade school, right, this kind of science didn't even really exist, right? And science and technology are advancing at such a rate. Right now in high school and even in university, we're training students for fields that maybe we don't even know are going to exist yet. Do you know what I mean? The jobs and the science that's going to be available to these people, 10, 20 years from now, I mean, maybe it doesn't even exist yet, right? So if you're excited about science, if you're excited about technology, right, then it's all about learning kind of the basic skills, right? It's not just about don't just be memorizing, okay, I need to memorize the periodic table if I want to be a chemist, right? That's not what science is. Science is a state of mind. Science is about questioning everything. And when you are posing these questions, it's all the scientific method, right? So you're asking the question, you're coming up with your hypothesis, and you're designing, how am I going to actually answer this question? And usually the answer just brings more questions, right? That's science. Okay. So what I would say, if science is exciting for you, then I wouldn't get necessarily intimidated by, oh my goodness, this nanotechnology, it sounds like something I can't understand. that's not what makes a scientist, like understanding everything. Scientists admit that they don't understand everything. Actually, real scientists will admit readily that they need help from everyone else, right, to understand all these different things, because you become such an expert in a small field that if you really want to make a difference, you have to work with other scientists, right, and engineers. So don't be intimidated. And what you should be learning in grade school and in high school, if this is where you want to end up, is how to ask questions and how to answer questions. That's all you need. And once you know that, then the questions that you ask and, the answers that you find, that's going to come. And you may be asking questions that I would never even imagine to ask right now, because the science just isn't there yet. So the future is exciting. There's a lot to learn. It's all about asking the right questions.
Yeah, so if they've got that passionate curiosity, don't hesitate to ask those questions.
That's it. Explore what's interesting to you, ask questions, and don't be intimidated by what you don't know, because even the experts, they would agree that what they know is really small. It's nano. And what they don't know is, what interests them and why they wake up and go to work every day.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank you for coming and joining us today, Dr. Derosa. It was incredibly interesting. I learned a lot personally, and I'm sure our viewers did as well. So unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today, and I'd like to thank everybody for joining us on the live stream. We hope you enjoyed our discussion on nanotechnology. And if you're interested in more live events, you can go to our website, which is pirweb.org. and follow the link to live events, and the schedule is there, and you can sign up and register and join in for more live events in the future. Thank you so much, and thank you, Maria.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.